and select the language that you would prefer. I would also just like to ask you to keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking, so that we're able to hear the other presenters as they're making their presentations without any problems. And for those of you who will be making presentations, I will request you to speak clearly and at a reasonable pace to allow the interpreters to be able to facilitate their sessions quite well. So once again, I'd like to say a very, very warm welcome to you. And thank you so much for being able to join into this session. And this is the first session, like I mentioned, the first session of the Africa Regional Consultation on the Pilot Guidance on Law and Public Health Emergency Preparedness and Response. My name is Stella, and I will be your moderator for the next 2 days during this consultative process. So as we know, the COVID pandemic has really exposed some critical weaknesses in existing frameworks for public health emergencies. But this crisis has also been what I would say a laboratory for some successful best practices. Through the pandemic, though the pandemic is still in a critical phase, as we've been able to see, there are a number of lessons that we've already been able to learn and that can be drawn from the improvement of both domestic and international law, including the steps that we need to ensure that domestic legislation effectively addresses major issues and implements states' obligations under the international health regulations. In response to the COVID-19, many states have relied on emergency decrees. They've been struggling with gaps between public health emergency management, social protection laws and institutions, and also trying to build a comprehensive response. But yet there are also some examples where solutions have been found and where this can be replicated to other countries across the globe. So in the middle of this year, around June 2021, Ifrc Disaster Law finalized a global research on law and public health emergency preparedness and response and lessons from COVID-19 pandemic, which we are calling the PHE report. This PHE report provides a detailed analysis of countries' existing laws and frameworks relating to public health risk management, the laws relating to the protection of vulnerable populations during public health emergencies, and also the legal facilities that have provided to humanitarian networks and other humanitarian organizations to enable them to better operate during this particular pandemic. Though the report is predominantly focused on the COVID-19 pandemic, it also has drawn on experiences from previous public health emergencies. Yes, Dorothy.
Sorry, please, for the interruption. If you can give me the host rights, I think there's a challenge on the French channel.
Okay. What I was really concerned about was this principles. Sorry.
Okay. One second. I should be able to do that right now. Apologies for this inconvenience. Let me just 1 second about that. Dorobin, it should be okay now?
Yes.
Apologies for that. That's the price we pay for this digital engagements that we have. So as I mentioned, so what we will be doing over the next 2 days is basically we'll be sharing with you the findings of this new Ifrc report, basically to help provide a clearer insight on the findings and the recommendations of the report. The analysis of the report has been synthesized into what we are calling the Guidance on Law and Public Health and Emergency Preparedness and Response. And this is a pilot version of this guidance, which focuses on preparedness and response to public health emergencies. So as key actors and advocates in the health and emergency preparedness and response sectors, we've invited you to this two-day consultation because we strongly believe that the report's recommendations, alongside the guidance on law and public health, can greatly support countries in their development of strong laws and policies and to better equip preparedness and response efforts related to public health emergencies. Therefore, over the next 2 days, we'll be hoping to hear your feedback on this guidance and what adjustments need to be made to better suit it to its intended purpose. We hope to hear from you on what next steps need to be taken with the support of the Ifrc disaster law and the Africa CDC to encourage states within Africa to engage in the review of the public health emergency management and disaster risk management frameworks once we're out of this COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the Africa CDC colleagues for partnering with us in the organization and also in the facilitation of this regional consultation. We do hope that this will be one of many engagements that we have with the Africa CDC. Additionally, recognizing how busy and digitally engaging this year has been for all of you, we really do thank you for taking the time to be here with us. And we look forward to engaging with you and having these conversations on that we're going to be having over the next 2 days. With that being said, I'm very honored to present to you the Africa CDC Director, Dr. John Ngasong, to give his opening remarks for this session. Dr. John, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Oui, on vous entend maintenant.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And let me first of all start by really recognizing and appreciating the very strong collaboration that is emerging between the Ifrc and Africa CDC. It's unique, and it lends itself for really greater impact in terms of expanding public health impact and outcomes on the continent by leveraging and harnessing our resources. The topic today we are discussing is so important. Law and public health in emergencies. We have seen and learned tremendously during this COVID-19 pandemic. And we've learned how international laws have worked and where they have not worked. We've learned how laws within the countries have worked and where they have not worked. So the COVID-19 truly is a laboratory of learning. It's a learning institution. I just hasten to say that we are in the middle of a pandemic where we truly don't know what the trajectory will look like, and with certainty, especially on a continent of 1.2 billion people, where less than 5% of the people have been fully vaccinated. The pandemic also taught us three things. One is that we are more connected than we thought we were as a people, sharing the same globe, that we are more vulnerable than we thought we were, and the inequities that exist are even greater than what we thought. And in the middle of this is public health laws and in that govern emergencies. It's amazing that when this virus was first, that is the COVID-19 virus, was first identified in Wuhan in December, it would take only about 3 months from that virus to spread from Wuhan to 165 countries, just less than 3 months. It shows you, or it weaponized the argument that I make for the connectivity that we are. And no one could have imagined that more vulnerabilities will be happening in countries that had even stronger health systems than in Africa. But it also exposes us that we need laws, and even laws that exist, we need to enforce them and implement them. The number one instrument that we all have that governs all of us in pandemics and outbreaks is the what we call by WHO the International Health Regulations that were revised in 2005. However, what have we learned collectively? First of all, that Even if law exists, and at times where they do not exist, we need laws that will govern the response itself across boundaries. Second, we need laws that will govern the protection of vulnerable populations during emergencies, as well as laws that will govern the response itself by partnerships when partners get involved. And then laws that will help us in managing the health emergencies. We also need laws that will also look into issues of access to response commodities, i.e. diagnostics, vaccines, and therapeutics.
Sales amounts to be applied and commission simply copy and paste.
I can hear a voice there. That's why I paused for 1 second. So I'm very pleased and delighted that Ifrc has taken greater leadership. Has taken leadership and is exercising leadership in conducting research in partnership with different bodies, including Africa CDC, to understand how public health laws can actually be enhanced or developed to guide pandemics or health emergencies, public health emergencies. Maybe I would make at this point pose to say that as we approach this, we should probably just take off emergencies and focus on how laws, we can implement laws, elaborate them, that will guide our public health practice as a whole. Because if we address that, then emergencies will automatically come underneath that, so that we are not really focused on just emergencies but public health, because at times, just good public health practice can lead to the avoidance of occurrence of emergencies or disease outbreaks. So we are very interested that these findings will be discussed, and we look forward to carrying forward further research with Ifrc so that we can actually understand how the lay of the land on the continent is with respect to public health laws and how they are being implemented or not implemented. As your technical public health agency on the continent, with the mandate to guide countries to prevent and control diseases, we look forward to strong partnerships that will bring evidence to the table, strong partnerships that will bring assets to the table, strong partnerships that will ensure efficiencies as we work across the continent. Public health is public health practice is a very broad area of work and requires that all of us join hands to make it happen. Let me just conclude by saying that we want to believe that this is the start of a long journey, a journey that will at least move from the framework and the finding of the studies to actually working with countries to developing or strengthening their laws that will be critical in implementing good public health practice. I look forward to continuous collaboration with Ifrc.
Thank you very much, Dr. John, for those opening remarks. It is indeed our intended hope that we will be able to turn words into action and be able to turn the recommendations that the report has found to be able to support national governments within the continent in strengthening their legislation on public health management. With that, it's now my honor and pleasure to present to you the Ifrc Deputy Director, Florine Clomega, to make her opening remarks. Florine, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stella. Africa CDC Director, Dr. John Kengasong, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome and thank you very much for joining for the regional launch of the report, Law and Public Health Emergency Preparedness and Response, Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic, and the Africa Region Consultation on the accompanying tool to the report, the Pilot Guidance on Public Health Emergencies and Response. We are honored to be hosting this event together with Africa CDC as one of the first events organized between the two institutions following the conclusion of an MOU in late August 2021 to strengthen our partnership in the pandemic response, as well as other areas of public health. No one has been spared from the effect of COVID-19, but the consequences of this pandemic have not been equally felt. This crisis has been defined by profound and persistent inequities resulting in the most vulnerable among us being left behind. We may not have known the full extent of what was to come when the pandemic was declared 18 months ago. And one thing we have learned is the importance of being ready and the integral role of law and policy in managing public health emergencies and in protecting communities. Legal and policy instruments have underpinned all facets of the COVID-19 response, from unprecedented restriction on freedom of movement and assembly to vaccine approval and, in some cases, access. The integral role of law and policies in the management of public health emergencies have been examined in detail by the Ifrc in the recently published report on law and public health emergencies, preparedness and response. The report analyzes the legal framework and response to COVID-19 and other public emergencies, such those caused by the Ebola, Zika, and SARS viruses in 32 countries around the world, including 5 countries on the African continent. The report finds that level of success in using legal and policy instruments to respond to the pandemic have varied widely, and in some cases, existing laws and policies have proven to be outdated and inadequate. Restrictions introduced to curb the spread of COVID-19 have also prevented some national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, the staff and volunteer, from performing their critical auxiliary role and fulfilling their humanitarian mandate as first responders to disasters and emergencies, as well as in providing community-based health and social care to vulnerable populations. Therefore, urgent action must be taken to strengthen domestic legal and policy framework for public health emergencies. States should consider reviewing and updating their laws and policies relating to public health emergencies risk management to ensure that they not only fit for modern purposes, but also adopt an all society approach that facilitates the participation of all actors and stakeholders, especially communities. The role of humanitarian actors such as the National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies in response to public health emergency should also be formalized in law and policies, with humanitarian actors being provided with appropriate exemption from restrictions during public health emergencies, subject to clearly set out health safeguards. When governments around the world emerge from the current crisis, it's our hope that many will wish to draw on the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic to review and strengthen their legal framework for disaster risk management, including public health emergencies. This report and its accompanying guidance document, the Guidance on Law and Public Health Emergencies, Preparedness and Response, will provide a valuable resource for government embarking on this endeavor. Guidance to be consulted on during the next 2 days is designed to support lawmakers and government officials with a structure for reviewing existing laws, policies, and plans relating to public health emergencies. It may also be used to inform national preparedness activities such as contingency planning, training, and simulation exercise, and to guide discussion and consultation on enhancing wider domestic disaster risk management arrangement. This tool has been developed with the knowledge that the success of any risk management framework is embedding lessons learned into laws and policies. Therefore, a key aim of the consultation today and tomorrow is to share with you in more details the findings and recommendations of the Law and Public Health Emergencies reports, as well as to provide a platform to hear your feedback on the pilot guidance. So this platform it is our expectation that your invaluable feedback as key actors in health emergencies and emergencies response will help strengthen the content of the guidance ensure that it serves its purposes within Africa. The Ifrc, through our work on disaster law, has 20 years of experience supporting national societies to provide technical advice to governments that are reviewing and updating the disaster-related laws. Together with National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies in the region and the Africa CDC, we stand ready to assist governments that wish to improve the legal preparedness for public health emergencies. The COVID-19 pandemic is indeed an opportunity to review law and policy for public health emergencies and to consider what improvements need to be made in the light of the lessons we've learned. Public health emergencies are not new and will continue to occur. Therefore, governments, lawmakers, humanitarian and development actors must act to strengthen legal preparedness and public health emergencies. We must seize this opportunity to ensure we don't get caught off guard again. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Florine, for your opening remarks. Indeed, we really hope that this guidance can be able to support the national governments and all public authorities and legislative development actors in the development of strong public health emergency management laws and policies. With that being said, we really do appreciate Dr. John and Florine for taking the time to be with us today. And before we get into the consultation itself, I really am encouraged to see all of you have been able to join into the room. And before we get started, I would like us to take a group photo. I know we're not able to meet with each other in person, but it's good that we start to see each other's faces. And as we begin to introduce each other as this session goes on, and before we have to bid adieu to Dr. John and Florine, I'll request you all to please turn on your cameras. My colleague Janique will be able to let us know once we're ready, and then we could be able to take a shot, if that's okay. So if you can, and if your bandwidth allows, please do turn on your cameras. Just to let everybody know who was asking in the chat, the presentation has not yet begun. This is just a still screen. So if you're able to turn on your cameras, we can be able to take the shot. Janique, please let us know when you're ready.
Stella, I think it might help to stop sharing your screen.
Okay,
now, just
let
so
me stop sharing. Is that better?
Yes, thank you. I'll just wait for a few more cameras to come on.
Great.
There we go. I'll take one shortly. One more.
Okay, great.
Perfect. I think that should work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Florine. Thank you, Dr. John, for making the time to be with us today and opening this session. I hope it will be one of many sessions that we do have together as IFRC and Africa CDC as we begin to engage in this very exciting partnership. So thank you to you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. So as we begin, for the structure of today's session, we will be having two presentations going into a deep dive into the different findings and recommendations within the Law and PHE report. We will be discussing the recommendations and findings regarding, relating rather to the institutional frameworks relating to the management of public health emergency, and also the implementation of international law, so that with respect to the international health regulations, as well as the Bangkok Principles. The first session will be facilitated by myself and my colleague Rachel, who will be taking us through the recommendations and findings on institutional frameworks. And the second session will be facilitated by Dr. Muita from the Africa CDC, who will be taking us through the implementation of international health regulations within Africa. After each session, we will be having breakout rooms, and within this breakout rooms is where we will be having the consultative process. So we will structure the breakout rooms just as we assess the number of participants we have in the room. We should be having about 5 or 6 participants in each breakout room, and there will be questions that will be shared in the breakout rooms for us to be able to discuss on this pilot guidance questions and how they relate to that particular topic that we will have discussed in the presentation preceding the breakout room. After the breakout room, we will have a plenary session where we will come back and share our discussions and highlight the main points from our rooms. And I would recommend that during these breakout rooms, we do assign a rapporteur, but we will be going through the breakout rooms just to support the discussions and to guide any challenges that they may be experiencing within the group. We will share these findings and the discussion points within the plenaries in each of the sessions, and that will be the wrap up. After that, we'll have a wrap up to the end of the day. I will again request you, if you are not speaking, I would request you to please keep your mic muted so that you allow the other participants to be able to hear the presenters clearly and without any challenges. And with that being said, I think we're just a little bit under schedule, but I will just get started. Let me reshare my screen and we can start on the first part of the presentation. Please let me know once you're able to see my screen. I think it should be visible now.
We can see it. Thank you, Stella.
Thank you so much, Janique. So just say once again, good afternoon to you all. For those who may have joined in late, my name is Stella. I'm the Acting Disaster Law Coordinator for the Ifrc for the Africa region. And wanted to take you quite briefly through to introduce you to what we're going to be discussing in today's presentation. But quite before we begin, I just want to give you a brief highlight of what the Ifrc Disaster Law program is. So Ifrc Disaster Law is basically a global team with about 13 members that are located in offices around the world. And I just, at this moment, just like to introduce you to my colleagues who are on the call. We have Janique, who is based in the Southern African office. She can turn on her camera. We have Reese as well, who's also based in the Southern African office in Pretoria. We have Rachel, who is based in the Geneva office, and we also have Maria, who is the disaster law coordinator for the region, but currently on assignment in the Indian Ocean Islands cluster. So, excuse me. So Ifrc's disaster law's main aim is to reduce human vulnerability to disasters by basically promoting effective legal and policy frameworks for disaster risk management. The Ifrc Disaster Law team and the program itself works in 3 main areas. One, which is providing, excuse me, technical assistance to governments to strengthen their laws. Also in building the capacity of national societies and other national stakeholders on disaster law, and also international stakeholders on disaster law. And additionally on conducting research and advocacy, including the development and the dissemination of guidance documents and best practices in the development of law with respect to disaster risk management. Going into the study that we finalized mid this year with respect to COVID-19, legal and policy instruments, basically, as Florine mentioned, have underpinned nearly every sector of COVID-19 response. We saw this when we had the unprecedented restrictions on movement and freedom of assembly, vaccine approval processes, vaccine distribution processes, and even some cases access to vulnerable populations or even access to vaccines. So at the outset of the pandemic, we saw very old laws and contingency plans and policies being put into action. And more often than not, we found that they were either inadequate and in basically dealing with what this modern problem was bringing, these varied events that were being brought about by the COVID pandemic. And this resulted in very rapid development of new laws in many, many countries. The integral role of law and policies in the management of public health emergencies was examined in this recent report that has been mentioned by Florine in her opening remarks, which is the report on law and public health emergency preparedness and response, lessons learned from the COVID pandemic. Our research took place in 2 phases. So at the very outset of the pandemic, we conducted mappings focusing on the emergency decrees and regulations that had been adopted in about 113 countries. These mappings, which we were referring to as emergency decree mappings, were completed between March and May of 2020. And they focused mostly on operational issues, so such as whether maybe national societies and other humanitarian organizations were being provided with exemptions from restrictions such as curfew, lockdowns, travel and border restrictions, business closures, and as well as what coordination measures were in place for responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So as the pandemic progressed, and with many additional legal issues emerging, we decided to look into more depth at the legal and policy frameworks, and now focusing on a much smaller group of countries. So this second set of mappings, which we are calling the PHE mappings, focus on about 32 countries spread across the globe. The PHE mappings focus was on domestic, legal, and institutional frameworks for public health emergency management, and how they interact with different laws and institutions for the general disaster risk management. There was also a focus on how law and policy is being used to mitigate secondary impacts of public health emergencies, for example, with respect to access to shelter for those populations that were being displaced or still being affected by internal and cross-border displacement, and also human mobility and how that the effects of restriction of movement and cross-border movement was affecting human mobility, and as well as the protection of vulnerable groups, such as those groups who have an increased susceptibility to gender-based violence, and particularly school children who have an increased vulnerability to exploitation or sexual exploitation in instances of disasters. While the emergency decrees were being focused exclusively on COVID-19, the PHE mappings focused on public health emergencies quite generally. And the researchers who were working on this report were asked to, wherever possible, to consider the laws and policies that were used to respond to previous public health emergencies. So we deliberately, in selecting these 32 countries, selected countries that had already experienced significant public health emergencies in the past, other than COVID-19. For example, within Africa, we had the Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, which were selected due to their experience with Ebola. And then within the Americas, we had Brazil, Colombia, and Honduras, who were selected due to their experience with the Zika virus. And finally, we had as well China and Singapore in the Asia Pacific region, who were selected due to their experience with SARS, and Korea, which was selected due to its experience with MERS. So in parallel to the public health emergency mappings, we also conducted a literature review on law and public health emergencies. So in this map, you can see just basically how the countries were spread out. The 32 countries were spread out. And as I mentioned, some of the countries that we focused on in Africa, it was Sierra Leone, Liberia, Nigeria, DRC, and as well as South Africa. So we analyzed the findings from the emergency decree mappings, the PHE mappings, the literature review in the new report, and we launched this report at the start of July 2021 after it was finalized in June. The Law and Public Health Emergency Preparedness and Response report, it provides comprehensive recommendations for how domestic laws and policies and plans can support effective preparedness and response for public health emergencies. And this report also makes a series of recommendations on how to strengthen domestic legal and policy frameworks for public health emergencies. The report, as we will see, highlights critical issues relating to legal and institutional frameworks for the management of public health emergencies, the protection of vulnerable groups, among others, that emerged during COVID-19, during the COVID-19 pandemic response. And it also makes a series of recommendations, as we're going to see in the course of the next 2 days, that support states in strengthening their domestic and legal policy frameworks for PHE response and management. So I just want us to watch a quick video that basically just sums up the findings of the report for your attention. Just let me get this out. Thank you. I hope that was clear, at least to break the monotony of hearing my voice that you've been hearing all through this session. So just going into the pilot guidance that we're going to be discussing the next couple of days, I just want to speak briefly so that I can hand over to my colleague, Rachel, for her segment. So the purpose of the consultation basically is to receive your feedback on the new pilot guidance that we have developed that's based on the Law and Public Health Emergencies report. The full title, as we've mentioned, is the Guidance on Law and Public Health Emergency Preparedness and Response, but we're simply going to be referring to it as the pilot PHE guidance. And it's very similar to a lot of the checklists that Ifrc Disaster Law has developed in terms of its structuring. For those of you who may be familiar with the program, you may be familiar with some of the checklists that we've been able to develop. It's a set of 9 targeted questions that can be used basically to identify strengths and gaps and weaknesses in existing laws, policies and plans that relate to public health emergencies. And these questions can be used as a guiding structure for a legislative review process. So for each of the questions, you will find that there's a brief discussion of the topic. There is a series of guiding sub-questions and which address specific issues. And then there are also suggestions about where to find more information about the topic. So these are the 9 questions that are within the pilot guidance, and we're going to be going through each of them in detail during our group discussions. So as I mentioned before, basically the purpose of the consultation is for us to receive your feedback on this document. So in addition, this consultation will basically also provide for us a forum for discussing key issues and experiences from the region, opportunities to strengthen domestic frameworks for public health emergencies in the region as well. The guidance, as I mentioned, is based on the report. So it's limited basically to covering the topics that were identified in the report. And it's not possible at this particular stage, as I mentioned earlier, to add on entirely new topics. So instead, the aim of the consultation will be to identify whether there are any gaps on or other issues in how the key topics are being addressed in the pilot guidance. And if so, how can these gaps be addressed? Another aim is to assess whether the pilot guidance provides clear and practical guidance on legal and policy frameworks for public health emergencies, and if it could be strengthened or improved in this regard. The structure, the consultation of the structure, the structure of the consultation is structured into the sessions that I mentioned. So in session 1, which is where we are right now, and then we will have another 2 sessions this afternoon that will be focusing on institutional frameworks. My colleague Rachel will be getting into that. Session 3 will be discussing on the implementation of international health regulations or international law relating to health regulations. Session 3 will be discussing about preparedness and contingency planning, early warning education. And then the session 5 will be focusing on 2 topics, which will be human mobility and migration, as well as the protection of vulnerable groups during PHEs. And then the last session, which would be at the end of tomorrow's session, would be discussing about regional priorities within Africa. What's already there, what's being addressed, how can Africa CDC and Ifrc be able to support stakeholders within the region in their processes of conducting legislative reviews and strengthening their laws and policies and plans. So in short, that is basically how this session is going to be structured. It's going to have a short presentation, some small group discussions about 30 minutes each, and a plenary discussion of about the same time. And there will be focus questions being provided for the small group discussions, and we'll be able to take notes in a shared Google Doc, or we could appoint a rapporteur, but we are also going to have note takers who will be coming around to support the different sessions as well, but we would recommend that our rapporteur be set up, and we will share this Google Doc as well. That is it from my side of the presentation. If there are no questions, I will hand over quickly to my colleague Rachel to go through session 1. Rachel, over to you. You're muted, Rachel.
Thanks for letting me know. Thank you very much, Stella. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here. As Stella mentioned, I'm a senior disaster law officer with Ifrc Disaster Law, and I'm based in Geneva, but I work very closely with Stella and the rest of the team in Africa. So I will just
بتاع افريكا CDC والاتحاد العالمي للصليب والهلال الاحمر ودي المعاهده العالميه لمنظمه الصحه العالميه.
I think you're good.
Good to go. Okay, great. Stella, I'm just wondering, is it possible for you to share your screen and keep going through the slides? Or would you prefer
Yes,
me?
let me just do that 1 second.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So as Stella mentioned, the focus of this section is on legal and institutional frameworks for preparing and responding to public health emergencies. So when I say legal and institutional frameworks, really this is a shorthand for a series of interrelated issues, such as what are the main laws, policies and plans in place? What actors and institutions are involved in managing PHEs, who does what and when, so that's the roles and responsibilities, and how do all of these different actors coordinate with one another. So we're really talking about a series of interconnected but very important issues. In the pilot PHE guidance, there are 2 questions that are related to legal and institutional frameworks. And these are the first question and the 9th question. So they're the first question and the last question. So question 1 asks, do your country's laws and policies establish a strong institutional framework for managing PHEs. And question 9 asks, do your country's laws ensure that the laws, policies and plans relating to PHEs are regularly updated to ensure that they are fit for purpose? So these 2 questions and the sub-questions in the guidance have been developed in light of the findings and recommendations in the PHE report. So what I'd like to do now is just take a little bit of time to look at those key findings and recommendations. One of the most important findings to come out of the PHE report is that a significant number of the states that we surveyed have quite old public health emergency laws. In fact, some of the states even had laws dating as far back as the early 1900s, and even in one case, the late 1800s. Now, of course, the fact that a law is old does not necessarily mean that it's a bad law or that it's weak or ineffective. It is possible that old laws may have been updated quite recently, but that they still have the date when they were originally made in their title. But the PHE report did find that older laws tend to have some features that are quite problematic. In particular, the older laws tended to apply only to a list of prescribed diseases or illnesses, rather than applying to all potential public health risks and biological hazards. And this means that the powers and the arrangements in the law would not be applicable to a new or emerging threat. And in some cases, the health risks that were specified in the laws are risks that are actually no longer prevalent. So for example, smallpox, which the WHO declared as eradicated in 1980. So of course, health and biological hazards are constantly evolving. And one important trend, which is now very well understood due to COVID-19, is the increase of zoonoses, meaning diseases or infections that are naturally transmissible from vertebrate animals to humans. And it's estimated that 3 out of 4 new or emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic. So given that health and biological hazards are constantly evolving, it is important for laws, policies and plans to be reviewed regularly to ensure that they remain up to date. And also to take what we call an all public health risks approach, which encompasses all different types of health and biological hazards that may cause a PHE, and not just a specific list of known existing illnesses or diseases or health threats. One practical way to do this, as shown on the next slide, is to adopt a legal definition of a public health emergency, which is very broad and which is not limited to certain diseases or illnesses. So for example, you can see here on the screen the WHO definition of public health emergency, which refers to an occurrence or imminent threat of an illness or health condition caused by bioterrorism, epidemic or pandemic disease, or a novel and highly infectious agent or biological toxin that poses a substantial risk of a significant number of human fatalities or incidents or permanent or long-term disability. And what is good about this definition in particular is that it's very broad and it applies to a wide range of health and biological hazards. Another practical way to implement an all public health risks approach is shown by the example of Singapore, which we identified during our research. In Singapore, the Infectious Diseases Act operates on the basis of a list of prescribed diseases. But the important thing is that there is a catch-all clause that extends the Act's powers and special arrangements to any disease with which the Director of Medical Services believes may cause an epidemic. So therefore, there is no need for the Act to be amended in order for a new threat to be addressed within the existing legal framework. There is simply the need for the Director of Medical Services to designate a disease as one falling within the Act. So we've discussed the issue of the age of legislation, and now I'd like to move on to the second key issue for discussion, which is the omission of the risk reduction and recovery phase. So as you know, in contemporary disaster risk management, we often speak about a cycle or a continuum from disaster risk reduction through to preparedness, response, and recovery. Unfortunately, another feature of the older laws that were identified in the study is that they tend not to address the risk reduction and recovery phases. And in fact, this was actually a feature of many of the more modern laws as well. And of course, this is a really serious omission because effective risk reduction measures can reduce the risk of PHEs occurring in the first place. So in particular, the risks posed by zoonotic diseases can be reduced through effective risk reduction measures, especially when using a One Health approach, which encourages coordination between the plant health, animal health, human health, and environment sectors. There were some positive examples in the PHE research of risk reduction approaches adopting a One Health framework, but this was actually quite uncommon overall. Just to give a couple of quick positive examples, in England and Wales, animal health legislation requires the maintenance of national contingency plans, and specific provision is made within those contingency plans for the control of zoonoses. And as another positive example, the Liberian Public Health Act also makes provision for dealing with zoonotic diseases and establishes a One Health coordination platform. But as I mentioned, these positive examples were not the most common approach, and were in the minority. And finally, it was not only the risk reduction phase that we found was omitted, but also the recovery phase is often omitted. And of course, as we know from COVID-19, but also the experience of other PHEs such as Ebola, public health emergencies can have very, very large scale society-wide impacts, including major economic impacts. And therefore it's critical to actually have a concerted and well-planned recovery effort guided by legal instruments. So I'll now just move on to the third topic, which is participation. So of course, again, the COVID-19 pandemic has really shown that a large-scale public health emergency can require action from virtually every tier of government, every sector of government, every community, and really every single individual. And for this reason, it's really underlined the importance of an all-of-society and all-of-state approach, which allows us to harness the resources and the capacity and experiences of all relevant actors. Unfortunately, the states that we surveyed generally did not have a well-embedded all-of-society and all-of-state approach in their laws relating to public health emergencies. While most of the states do have laws and policies that enable the participation of different entities within government, there is a focus on the departments or agencies that are perceived as the core actors, such as the Health Department or the National Disaster Management Office. But of course, we know that almost every sector within government has a role to play, especially for large-scale public health emergencies. And so there's a need for all different departments within government to be included. Another quite concerning point is that our research revealed that there was little opportunity for stakeholders outside of government to be formally enabled to participate in PHE preparedness and response. As for other disasters, community involvement is especially important and can really improve surveillance and communication of public health information. And in addition to communities, there are a number of actors and stakeholders that it's very important to include in public health emergency preparedness and response, but who may be overlooked and not given a formal role to play. And if we just go to the next slide, I have a list of some of those really critical actors and stakeholders that need to be involved. So they include One Health actors and community representatives, as I've already mentioned, but also development cooperation actors, the health and social care sectors, representatives of vulnerable groups and groups who may be at higher risk, humanitarian actors such as National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, schools and school authorities, the financial sector, and manufacturers and suppliers of essential goods and equipment. So I'll now move on to the next issue which I'd like to discuss, which is the issue of coordination. Now, I'm sure that many of you would have experienced coordination challenges, whether that's in your experience of general disaster management or specifically in the PHE context, because coordination is really a perennial problem in international and domestic disaster response operations. It's an issue that comes up time and time again, and it's something that's very difficult to get right, especially in light of the sheer number of different actors and stakeholders that need to be involved in order to have an effective preparedness and response. There are many different types of coordination that need to take place. We need to have coordination horizontally between different entities within government and also between governmental and non-governmental actors. But we can also say that coordination needs to happen vertically between different levels of government. And that's especially in the case of federal states or states that have very strong regional or provincial governments. And finally, coordination is actually also required within sectors. So for example, within the health sector or even within the health department, there are a number of different units and entities that need to work effectively together. So in our research, we found, interestingly, that many of the states surveyed use general disaster management coordination mechanisms for preparing and responding to public health emergencies, rather than having separate or specialized public health emergency coordination mechanisms. So what I mean by that is that the same coordination mechanisms that are used to respond to other types of disasters, such as floods or fires, are used also for public health emergency response in many of the countries surveyed. In some cases, there are public health emergency specific sub-mechanisms, for example, subcommittees of main committees, but these still operate within a general disaster risk management framework. So this approach has some benefits, but also some potential risks. A benefit is that it avoids duplication and that the actors that are involved already know how the coordination mechanisms work. But on the other hand, and coming back to the point I made earlier, there is a risk that the general disaster management coordination mechanisms do not include all of the different actors and stakeholders that need to be involved in preparing and responding to PHEs, especially in the case of a very large scale and serious PHE. So I'll just move on to the next slide. And basically, in light of all of these different findings that I've just discussed, we have a set of recommendations on legal and institutional frameworks. So we recommend that laws, policies, and plans relating to public health emergencies should be reviewed periodically. So for example, every 5 years or perhaps even more frequently, and also after a public health emergency occurs. We recommend that they should adopt an all public health risk approach, which is not limited to addressing specific known existing illnesses, diseases, or health risks. We recommend addressing all of the different phases of risk management, and also adopting a One Health, all of government and all of society approach. And in particular, we really emphasize the importance of facilitating the involvement of the very broad range of actors and stakeholders that have relevant experience and capacity in relation to public health emergencies, including communities, One Health actors, development actors, health and social care providers, representatives of vulnerable groups, humanitarian organisations, schools and school authorities, the financial sector, and again, manufacturers and suppliers of essential goods and equipment. So just to come back to the guidance, we have, of course, as I mentioned, question 1 and question 9, which relate to legal institutional frameworks. And then underneath question 1 and question 9, there's a set of much more detailed and specific questions which get into all of the specific issues that I've just discussed in the last 10 to 15 minutes. So that concludes the discussion of our legal and institutional frameworks. I believe we may be about to have an icebreaker and then an opportunity for some small group discussion about this topic. I just want to say that I really look forward to hearing in the breakout rooms your experiences and your perspectives on this topic.
Thanks so much, Rachel, for that presentation. If there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll be able to address them either right now or after we have the group discussions during the plenary sessions. If there's anybody with a very burning question that would like to ask right now, please feel free to raise your hand and then I will prompt you to unmute your mic. If not, I want us to quickly have a little bit of an icebreaker. I saw that everybody has been introducing themselves within the chat, and we just want to know who is in the room in terms of what sectors that you're working on, and how we can engage with each other. So we're going to have a little bit of a small Menti that's just going to do a quick assessment. So just allow me to put it up very quickly. So just 1 second. Fantastic. Okay. So if you are familiar with menti.com, I want you to just go to I'm just going to put it on the screen right now. Sorry, that's the wrong one. Okay, here we go. I want to share my screen now. Seems to have given me an error. Technology. Okay, I think we're okay now. So I just want you to go to menti.com. I think you can see my screen now. I'm sharing the right presentation. Go to menti.com and then put in the code that you can see at the top of my screen. Please let me know if you can see my screen, Janique.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so I just want us to go into menti.com, put in the code that's at the top of my screen, and I'm going to prompt just a couple of questions for you, just to ask you, what sector do you work in? Is it disaster risk management, public health, development, environment and climate change, or any other sector? We just want to know who's in the room. So go to menti.com, use the code 914891779. So we have a few people already joining in and submitting sectors that they're working in. So we have a lot of actors from public health. We have some actors from disaster risk management. We have an actor in development. So we're spreading out, which is good. That's how we know that we're listening to all the relevant voices. As Dr. John said in his opening remarks, it's good to have this kind of engagement that is very broad spectrum. Excellent. You can keep on selecting the different sectors you work in. So also the next question is, what type of organization do you work for? Do you work for a government organization, national society, international organization, a regional organization, or a civil society organization, or any other organization? Excellent. I can see we're represented quite across the board, which is fantastic. Fantastic to see. We have a lot of government representatives in the room, which is great. We have national society counterparts as well, international organizations, regional organizations. This is really excellent. So we just wanted to have a brief outlook just to see, so that you can see when you're getting into the breakout rooms, we're talking about having an all of society approach. As Rachel mentioned in her presentation, it's important for us to really make sure that we're involving everybody in these engagements in terms of the development of public health legislation and disaster risk management health legislation generally. So please feel free to keep engaging with that mentee. And now we're going to check into the breakout rooms, which I'm just going to set up right now. So we're going to have, I'm just trying to confirm how many participants we have in the room. We're going to have one breakout room in French. And I would request Elvis, if you do not mind, to be in that group to facilitate the discussions. I will set you up in that group, and then we will have a couple of groups in English and English-speaking groups. I'm going to set up the groups for you to select the group that you would prefer to be in, and then we can be able to do that. Just want to see whether I have been given this rights. Dorbin, I think you are the one who has the hosting rights, so we need to set up the three rooms rather. Urban, if you could set up 3 groups, 2 English-speaking groups and 1 French-speaking group. Sorry, 4 groups, 2 English-speaking groups and 1 French-speaking group and 1 Arabic-speaking group. I am going to share my screen once again, and then I'll be able to share the screen during each of the groups to share the questions for the discussions. So just allow me to share my screen once more so that you can see the questions that are going to be discussed during the group discussions.
Then.
Sorry, Dorbin.
Is it easier? Maybe I make you the host so that you can.
Yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead. Please make me the host. I'll make the groups. So share the questions on her screen. Okay. So Dorbin, have you been able to make me the host so that I could set up the groups? It's now Chantal, that's the host, not me. Dorbin, I think you've made Shanta the host.
Yes, I'm trying. Just 1 second. I'm not sure how it went, Shanta.
Okay. So as we're sorting out that, again, technical challenges will always be when we have a digital platform. So these are the questions, the discussion questions that we will be having. What does it mean for domestic actors to have clear roles and responsibilities for managing public health emergencies? What kind of actions, phases of disaster management hazards need to be addressed? Which non-governmental actors have an important role to play in public health emergencies? What are the best ways to ensure their meaningful participation and representation? What are the different types of coordination that are required for public health emergencies? What kinds of mechanisms or measures can promote effective coordination? What is the importance of reviewing and updating public health laws, policies? How often should this be done? And who should be responsible? And provide some general reflections and comments on questions 1 and 9 of the pilot guidance, and whether these questions identify key issues, whether there are any gaps, should any questions be changed or new questions added. So we will be having a Google document that will allow us to have these discussions in the groups. Janique, sorry, do you mind sharing the Google Doc? Maybe we could post it in the chat. The link to the Google Doc, we could post it in the chat.
Will do.
Thank you. If there are any questions from the presentation that we had, please feel free to ask as we try to sort out the breakout rooms.
Dr. Shanta, if you are in the room, please. I think it's only you who can help us now by changing the host rights from your side to either Stella or myself. So you need to go to the participants list.
How do I go, Darwin?
Click on participants. At the bottom of your screen, you have participants. Yes. Showing 41 now. So if you click on it, you will have a list of the participants who are in the meeting.
Okay.
Then we select on, you can select on mine, select on my name, Dorobin Agoti. Okay. Then you have an option for more.
Yeah.
So when you click on more, you'll see the option to make me host.
Co-host. Make host.
Yes, host. Make host.
Is that okay?
Yes. Thanks, Dr. Shanta.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so Stella, go ahead and make you the host.
Yes,
You're
thank you.
now okay. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Dorobin. So I'm just going to set up the breakout rooms right now. I'm going to let you as participants choose the rooms so that you're able to go to the French speaking room and the English speaking rooms accordingly. I'm just going to add 2 rooms, 3, 4 rooms. Okay. I'm opening all the rooms. Please join into the room, either English speaking room 1, 2, French room 1, Arabic room 1, so that you're able to begin the discussions, and then we will be able to jump in and share with you this discussion questions that would be for the group. So please go ahead and join in the groups. The discussions will be about 30 minutes, and I will broadcast a message to everybody on that.
Hi, Stella.
Yes, Mercy.
Yeah, is it possible to label the groups as per the different thematic areas so that we know where we're going? Because I just see English from 1, room 2.
Yes, so
it's just
we are all going to be discussing the
very
same. We're all going to be discussing the same questions in the groups, in the breakout rooms. So I'm just going to support you in moving to the different rooms.
Hello.
Sorry, somebody is speaking. The interpreters in the room.
in the letter. Hello.
I think we are all back into the main room. Janique, Rachel is in the room. Elvis is in the room, so I'm thinking we're all back. Fantastic. I was able to go through a few of the rooms and I could see that the discussions were really quite rich, and I could see that there was a lot of engagement, and I'm really excited to hear about the discussion. So I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Janique for her facilitation, and we should be able to then have the next presentation on implementing international law in the next few minutes. Over to you, Janique. Janique, you're muted.
Thank you, Stella. Sorry, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody for participating in the breakout room. I'm going to just quickly share my screen so that the slide comes up.
Yep.
There we go. Can everybody share my see my screen?
Yes, thanks, Janique.
Thank you, Reese. Great. I would just like to now give the opportunity to the different groups to just provide us with a brief overview of what they discussed with regards to the 5 questions on the slides in their breakout rooms. So I'll first give the opportunity to the first English speaking group. I'm not sure, I think Rachel, you might have been in that group. Is there a speaker that was nominated to provide feedback?
Yes, go ahead, Elsa.
Hi, my name is Asma, and I will give a little brief on our discussion. The discussion was indeed very rich, as Stella mentioned, and we covered all 5 questions. I will just move in. I'm not going to go in like a traditional 1 question and 2, I'm just going to give like a overall brief. I think the past, we were talking about the past and the future data that helps us identify phases of action for short-term and long-term for domestic actors to function with the key actors to help address the current function of how to respond to public health emergencies. It's also important to coordinate and to identify the roles and the responsibilities of who is doing what to have a very clear direction and define the way forward to each institution and what they are responsible for. I mean, I think everybody worked with the government and everybody worked alongside the government, and some key players worked on their own. So identifying who is doing what is a very important way forward for us to reduce the conflict that could happen from lack of understanding of the roles, and to provide a very feasible and easy flow of the direction to actually tackle the disaster at hand and to prevent stagnation during the process. We also discussed that there were some problems with points of entry, securing preparations and response mechanisms with different stakeholders and private sectors to ensure the smooth communication to facilitate the mechanisms within the national societies and the nation itself or a society itself, transportation entities. We also mentioned that it was important to engage with the private sector because the private sector is somewhat not very immersed within the governmental sector. So it's important to actually have a communication means with the private sector to build a form of trust and to ensure the safety of the community. We moved on to internal within the organization's coordination and means of coordination to have internal and external international coordination with a wide range of authority and governmental sectors by integrating what is currently occurring to ensure adaptability in a dynamic nature to engage with a direct impact to mapping of the actors who deliver the society. An important point was also raised here that coordination is not communication. Actually, proper communication with the proper stakeholders to ensure facilitation of the actions, to cascade the actions within the proper time for us not to lose unnecessary time during emergencies. Time is of essence, so we need to deliver without the need of losing any time for lack of communication or improper communication means. We also talked about the laws and policies, about reviewing the laws and policies. The laws are not applicable due to the changes witnessed in our day-to-day work. The work way of the past does not support the current situation in means of technology, in the way culture has sometimes or somewhat is different. We can use, and another point was raised that we can use the old laws or the old policies as a guide, but not to actually move forward with it. So amend the regulations to easily change the acts and which are less time consuming. It means the policy disaster management can be addressed by the acting ministry to respond in accordance to the nature of the disaster at hand. Some countries witnessed that every type of disaster had a certain ministry in capital to respond to it. And then we talked a little bit about the internally displaced during the difficult times, the adjustment of internal policies to be inclusive for all cases to ensure humanitarian legal framework that leaves nobody behind, to ensure legal preparedness to save the time and efforts during the disaster response. Hold on. I hope I covered everything, Rachel. I'm not sure if there is anything that I did not cover, please step ahead and take the lead. Thank you.
I think that was an amazing and very, very thorough summary. Thank you very much, Asma.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your intervention. It was a really, really, really interesting overview that you gave, and I definitely saw some overlap with the discussions from the group that I was in. So thank you so much. I will now go to the group that I was in, English group 2. I'll quickly just share my screen. But over to you, Mr. Mukumbi, just to give a brief overview of what we spoke about within our group.
Share the screen, please, because I want to use it. share the screen, please. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I think the two groups really converged on many aspects of the answers to the question. And like they are on question one, clarifying the roles because of given diverse actors, a range of actors played a critical role in the management, both in terms of sectors involved, so that there was a unit of purpose. And knowing the roles and responsibility was very, very important to all stakeholders to be aware of the chain of command as very important, so that we all point or shoot in the same goal, ensuring that all the groups in the especially the vulnerable groups were catered for. It was also mentioned that we needed a pre-developed plan to make sure that we cover all the aspects of the plan. Otherwise, if we don't have the roles very clearly spelled out, people may concentrate on one area of plan and leave others not attended. When we go to question two, we found that we are very converging with the previous group about the private, about the media, but what we added there is the traditional leaders, the religious leaders, and the community leaders really should be part of the actors in this emergency. On question three, I'm not repeating what group two already gave. I'm just giving addition which group, the previous group really gave. On the type of coordination, it was both vertical and horizontal, was very key, especially using the incident management system, which allows both horizontal and vertical, and within a jurisdiction or within a sector, the coordination using that system was really very comprehensive in the coordination. And also we talked about the operation emergency operation center. There's a handbook here, which is very useful to spell out the coordination mechanism in many aspects. And we talked about multi-sectoral coordination, and of course, both national and international. And we singled out the regional Africa CDC regional coordinating center as one of the ways we could ensure that coordination is smooth. On question four, it was recommended that we proactively review every 5 years, and because the hazards are also evolving, we needed to be ahead of the hazards rather than outbreaks or pandemic being in front of us or behind the legislation. So that it was very, very important that whenever it is necessary, if it's not necessary, but at least there should be an effort to see, are we really still, are the laws still pertaining to the current situation or to the evolving situation. Of course, one platform was suggested, but also to be guided by the Attorney General, because the Attorney General is the custodian of the law. And also we talked about synchronization. Synchronization will be done by the custodian of the law, because he knows all the laws from different sides, and then he will synchronize those laws very, very, very well. And of course, there was a need to also, we said, when you are making laws, you should really make laws according to the current situation, and also for the future, forward-looking making of laws. Don't just make laws for today, but look forward, be forward-looking, and that will help so that these laws are really suitable or address the purpose. And of course, also we said that they should have provisions for some of the authorities to make statutory instrument so that the current issues can be solved, or we can use regulations which back up the law or which operationalize the law, so that this can be changed to suit the current situations or environment. We talked about the provision of question 5. Really, we didn't have time to talk about it, But otherwise, I see we have really converged very well with the previous group. Most of the things there we spelled them out as the previous group. I submit, Chair.
Thank you so much for summarizing our discussion so well. And yes, definitely, there was a lot of overlap between the two groups. Let me just quickly get the slide back up. And then I will hand over to the French group, please. The presenter from the French group, I'd like to invite you to give a summary of your discussion, please.
OK. Bonjour, bonsoir à tout le monde. J'espère que vous m'entendez. Est-ce que vous pourriez partager l'écran, s'il vous plaît, des travaux de notre groupe? Est-ce que vous pouvez partager l'écran?
Jenny, can you share
Yes,
can you share,
sure. Let
share
me
the
just
screen,
quickly
please?
pull up the Google Doc again. Sorry, it just might take a second for me to get to it.
OK. Merci. Donc, dans notre groupe, comme vous pouvez le voir, les propositions que nous avons faites de la compréhension qu'il faut y avoir de la définition des rôles et des responsabilités, c'était, on a noté l'insuffisance de la législation, mais on s'est surtout attardé sur la nécessité, ça voulait dire pour nous, institutionnaliser le point focal national du règlement sanitaire international dans les pays. Ça signifiait aussi pour nous de définir dans les lois nationales et de catégoriser les urgences et les événements de santé publique. Ça signifiait, est-ce que je peux défiler ça moi-même? Non. Est-ce que vous pouvez défiler, s'il vous plaît? Voilà. Ça signifiait également de contextualiser les concepts internationaux dans les cadres juridiques nationaux. À la question sur la participation, nous avons pensé que le secteur privé de la santé était l'un des groupes qui devait participer, que ce soit le secteur privé hospitalier ou bien toutes les autres professions médicales et paramédicales qui interviennent dans le secteur privé de la santé. Nous avons également identifié le secteur privé compris comme des entreprises privées locales ou bien internationales. Nous avons également identifié des organisations, des groupes, bien des populations vulnérables, mais aussi... Are you getting me? Allô? Allô? Est-ce que vous
Yes, we can hear you, Christy. Oui.
OK, merci. Donc, il y a également, nous pensons également que les ordres professionnels de la santé sont des parties prenantes importantes quand on est dans la gestion des événements et des urgences de santé publique, et également les organisations de patients, de malades et des bénéficiaires de tout type. Comment est-ce que ces organisations-là doivent être intégrées? Nous avons pensé que on pourrait les faire participer à la planification dans le cadre de la préparation. Vous pouvez continuer à défiler, s'il vous plaît. Malheureusement, je ne peux pas le faire moi-même. OK. Donc, la troisième question portait sur la coordination. Donc, nous avons dit que nous avons pensé que la coordination devait être hiérarchisée, qu'il y avait une coordination qui devait se faire à l'intérieur du secteur de la santé et que ça pouvait être fait à travers les centres des opérations d'urgence santé publique. Nous avons pensé qu'il devait y avoir également une coordination qui déborde le secteur de la santé et qui se fait avec les autres secteurs. Nous avons pensé également qu'il y avait un autre niveau de coordination qui était la coordination nationale, mais aussi la coordination par niveau d'intervention. C'est ce que nous avons appelé la coordination décentralisée. Suivant, s'il vous plaît. Donc, quelle est l'importance de la révision ou bien de la mise à jour des cadres juridiques et des politiques? Nous pensons que l'important, c'est pour pouvoir mettre à jour justement les politiques. Dans notre groupe, nous avons pensé que même si nous avons admis la fréquence minimale de 5 ans pour les évaluations, nous pensons qu'il est très important que la recommandation qui a été faite aux pays de l'Union, à la majorité des pays de l'Union africaine, dans le cadre des évaluations externes ou conjointes de la mise en œuvre du RSI, d'évaluer la capacité de leur cadre juridique national à soutenir les interventions en matière de santé publique puisse être mise en œuvre. Maintenant, à partir de cette évaluation qu'on peut considérer dans la plupart des pays comme étant l'évaluation de base, on pourra définir une fréquence. Nous avons également pensé qu'il est important qu'on mette en place dans les systèmes des systèmes de veille juridique, qui est une surveillance continue de la législation pour voir si les législations qui sont prises, celles qui existent, sont capables de soutenir les interventions en matière de santé publique de façon générale, pas seulement la gestion des urgences. Et nous avons pensé que ce sont les ministères en charge de la santé publique qui devraient avoir le lead sur tous ces systèmes de veille juridique, mais également sur les évaluations de cadres juridiques relatifs à la gestion des événements et des urgences santé publique. Donc, je pense que globalement, c'est à ce niveau que nous nous sommes arrêtés. Je vous remercie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your feedback. It was really interesting to see the overlap between the different groups, and also very good to see the overlap between the feedback that was given in the groups and the PHE guidance itself. So I'd just like to thank you all again for your very active participation in the groups. And then I would now like to hand over to my colleague Stella for the next presentation on the findings and recommendations from the Law and PHE report on implementing international law. So over to you, Stella. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Janique. Let me just go back to sharing the presentation screen. I'll be very quick. So during this session, I'm just going to take you briefly through the findings of the report, and then I'm going to hand over to Dr. Muita from the Africa CDC to just give a brief overview of the Africa CDC perspective on implementation of international law with respect to the international health regulations. So this session, basically, we're going to be discussing two questions from the pilot guidance, which is about the integration of the public health emergencies and disaster risk management frameworks, and also the implementation of the international health regulations. So starting with the first section, which is on the integration of DRM and public health, we have the first question, which is question 2 in the pilot guidance, which asks, are your country's laws and policies relating to public health emergencies integrated with your country's wider disaster risk management policies? And then we have question 3 and its guiding sub-questions, or rather question 2 and its guiding sub-questions are based on the findings and the recommendations on integration of the public health emergencies report. And we're going to go through those findings and recommendations. So when we start talking about the integration between disaster risk management and public health emergencies, so the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction defines a disaster as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society at any scale due to hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity leading to one or more of the following: either human, material, economic, and environmental losses and impact. This definition, as you can see, is really broad enough to encompass any type of disaster, regardless of its cause. And this definition, we can therefore argue that it does include public health emergencies such as COVID, Ebola, as we've seen in the past. So although public health emergencies fall within the definition of a disaster, they can sometimes be regulated separately to other types of disasters through specific laws and policies and plans. And we see this at the international level because there has been an increasing emphasis on integration between disaster risk management frameworks and public health emergency frameworks. And in 2016, the International Conference on the implementation of health aspects of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction from 2015 to 2030 adopted the Bangkok Principles. So the Bangkok Principles recommend the systematic integration of health risks and biological hazards into DRM, and conversely, the integration of disaster risk management into health strategies and systems. However, what's not clear from the Bangkok Principles is exactly what integration means in practical terms. This is something that's really quite essential in guiding development of this kind of legislations and understanding where the points of convergence. Also, it's not really clear exactly how public health emergencies and disaster risk management frameworks can actually interact with one another in most countries. One of the aims of the public health emergency mappings that I mentioned at the beginning of this particular session we're having today was to develop a better understanding of this, what this interaction would look like. So the Public Health Emergency Report, the Law and Public Health Emergency Report, basically finds that there are three broad categories of framework for public health emergency risk management, with differing levels of integration from general frameworks. So we'd see the public health emergency dominant frameworks, and these are based solely on public health emergencies or public health legislation, with DRM or state emergency legislation only applying in extreme circumstances. We have those that are like a hybrid framework, which are mainly based on either on public health emergency management, but with disaster risk management or states of emergency laws that are supporting and supplementing that legislation to a lesser or to a greater extent. So for example, we have disaster risk management instruments that may establish coordination arrangements or provide general emergency powers. And then we also have the disaster risk management dominant frameworks that are based solely on disaster risk management legislation. And we have health risks and biological hazards and public health emergencies all falling within the scope of this general disaster risk management legislation. To understand these frameworks, what these frameworks look like, I'm just going to give you an example of each. So when we think about a public health emergency dominant framework, for example, we have such in the UK public health emergencies. In the UK, public health emergencies are expected to be dealt with by regulations made under or powers contained in its public health legislation. So that's the Public Health Control of Diseases Act of 1984. And in extreme circumstances, however, the government can fall back on its main piece of disaster risk management legislation, which is the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004, if the public health specific instruments prove to be insufficient. An example of the hybrid framework, so this is found in Colombia. And in Colombia, there are public health laws governing and monitoring of epidemics, the monitoring of epidemics and controlling sanitation of ports, for example, ships, vehicles, and declaring states of emergency. However, reliance is also placed on general disaster risk management legislation, including decrees and laws that are establishing Colombia's National Calamity Fund and its national risk management policy. Moreover, the Colombia Public Health Emergency Mapping reports that the actual operational management of the COVID-19 response was undertaken by general disaster risk management institutions. And then an example of the DRM dominant framework, we find this in South Africa. And in South Africa, the Disaster Management Act of 2002 is a comprehensive all-hazard instrument. Its definition of disaster is quite similar to the official definition of the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, and it's broad enough to cover public health emergencies. The response to COVID-19 was reported as being managed within the powers of the Disaster Management Act and its associated regulations. So by the very nature, disaster risk management dominant frameworks achieve complete integration because there's no separation between disaster risk management and public health emergencies. In disaster risk management frameworks, there's one single legal and institutional framework that addresses all these types of hazards. while this type of framework may be appealing, we cannot say that it's necessarily better than other types of frameworks because there's no research currently, or there's no evidence currently that shows how effective the different types of frameworks are in practice. We see that DRM dominant frameworks are also uncommon. Only 3 of the countries surveyed in the PHE mappings actually fell into this category. The report also finds that by far the most common type of framework is the hybrid framework. And we see that in the hybrid frameworks, there's a mixture of different instruments at play, both that are public health emergency specific, and then there are others that are focusing on general disaster risk management. So this creates a risk, sometimes it creates a risk of gaps, conflicts, or even an unnecessary duplication of powers and roles and responsibilities. And other arrangements created by different instruments can also be problematic. Also, to the extent that the different instruments create separate government bodies, as we see in most cases when we have a public health management institute and a separate disaster risk management institute, this might lead to coordination challenges during public health emergency management. And I'm sure some of you might have experienced this in your countries at the outset of COVID-19. So the recommendations that the report does provide in light of these findings is that any particular type of framework, it doesn't recommend one particular type of framework over the other, but it recommends the integration between, or rather the alignment between the disaster risk management frameworks and the public health emergency frameworks by basically identifying and eliminating gaps, conflict, inconsistencies, or unnecessary duplication between the powers, roles and responsibilities, and other arrangements between the public health emergencies and disaster risk management instruments. In practice, this basically means that whenever a public health emergency or disaster risk management instrument is developed, or it's being updated, or it's being reviewed, there should be a holistic approach that considers how the instrument will relate to all other applicable instruments. These recommendations are reflected in question 2 of the pilot guidance that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. So moving on to the second segment on implementation of the international health regulations, and this relates to question 3 of the guidance. And question 3 asks, do your country's laws implement and facilitate compliance with international health regulations? It has several guiding sub-questions rather, which target the specific issues that need to be considered. And question 3, just similar to question 2 and the other questions, is based on the findings of the report. So with regards to international health regulations, and as many of you on the call might be aware, they're the most important international instrument relating to public health emergencies. There's an international treaty that is legally binding on 196 member states. The IHR established a comprehensive set of rights and obligations relating to public health risks and public health emergencies of international concern. The term public health emergency of international concern is defined by the IHR as an extraordinary event, which is determined by the Director General of the WHO to constitute a public health risk to other countries through the international spread of disease and potentially require coordinated international response. The international health regulations state parties to develop, strengthen, and maintain the domestic capacities to detect, assess, notify, and report public health events, and to respond promptly to the effectively to public health risks and these public health emergencies of international concern. These capacities are known as the IHR core capacities, and Annex 1 of the International Health Regulations does outline exactly what is required to meet these core capacities. Unfortunately, as we've seen a series of reviews undertaken by under the IHR or at the behest of WHO between 2011 and 2016, they highlight a widespread failure by states to implement the core capacities required by IHR. So WHO has really sought to promote domestic implementation of the IHR core capacities through its IHR monitoring and evaluation framework, which includes annual reporting, joint external evaluations, simulation exercises, and even after action and more recently intra-action reviews. The joint external evaluation in particular has considerable potential benefit in supporting its implementation. So this joint external evaluation is a voluntary process in which a team of internal and external experts jointly assess the country's ability to prevent, to detect, and to respond to public health threats. States have completed a joint JEE, have generally taken positive action to address the identified shortcomings in their international health regulations core capacity implementation. However, a weakness is that this evaluation is voluntary, so there's no obligation on states to carry it out and to post or to implement the findings or to develop post-evaluation action points, and this can be quite a challenge in the successful implementation of IHR. In addition to the IHR core capacities and other key obligations imposed by the IHR are to designate or establish a national IHR focal point, which some of you in the room are, and the authorities responsible for implementing the measures under the IHR, and also to ensure competent authorities maintain effective contingency arrangements to deal with the unexpected public health event, and as well as require the competent authorities to communicate with the national IHR focal point on relevant public health measures that are taken pursuant to the international health regulations. There are also obligations to notify WHO of all events that may constitute a public health emergency of international concern within its territory, as well as any health measure implemented in response to such events, and also to continue to communicate with WHO in a timely, accurate, and sufficiently detailed public health information on the notified event. And I think we saw a lot of this happening in the COVID-19 management process globally. So one good practice identified by the report is establishing a committee or other body responsible for the overseeing and monitoring and implementation of IHR. So for example, as a means of encouraging implementation of the international health regulation, Argentina's Ministry of Health established a commission for the implementation and monitoring of the international health regulations and core capacities. And through the commission, the Ministry of Health coordinates action with other ministries, the Argentinian provinces, and key non-state actors regarding implementation of strategies to respond to public health emergencies and implement the IHR. So the recommendations of the report are that laws and policies should provide for the establishment of IHR monitoring, an IHR monitoring committee, specifically for overseeing the implementation of the IHR obligations and monitoring ongoing operation and compliance. Requiring the laws should require the production and implementation of post-evaluation action plans following the evaluation of IHR implementation, and identifying the domestic actors that are responsible for producing and implementing these post-evaluation plans. Also, that states should continue to take steps that are necessary to ensure that their domestic legislation implements and facilitates the IHR core capacities and meets their obligations under the IHR. We should also consider whether implementation of the IHR could be improved by making express provision for the IHR focal point and their functions in domestic laws and or policies, and review whether there are legal obstacles to the national IHR focal point sharing information with WHO and other states, and if so, implement legal reforms to remove these obstacles. And we can see that these recommendations are reflected in question 3 of the pilot guidance and its guiding sub-questions. So before we move on to the second breakout room discussions, I just want to invite Dr. Mwita, who had a few reflections to share about the implementation of the international health regulations. So over to you, Dr. Mwita.
Thank you, Stella. just to pick from where you left and reflecting on the opening remarks by Dr. John this morning, I think this afternoon, sorry, but it could be morning for some others, is to reflect on the international laws, how they succeeded, how they failed, the national laws we have, our countries, how they succeeded and how they failed. And tying all that back to the IHR, the International Health Regulations, and as Stella has very well summarized, although they are legal, they are legal instruments are designed on by, I believe, 194 member states of the WHO. They are very much not or have not been enforced, and I think that has been very clear during the COVID outbreak, this pandemic. They are obligations, and as we know, as we have observed, many member states have not always followed those. We could give examples, but I'm sure this panel here knows many examples. Now, in addition, given that they are implemented at the national level in member states, they are not specific to most vulnerable groups. And so we continue to see those groups being missed in a lot of aspects as far as the IHRs are concerned. Now, there has been amendment after the 2016 WHO Assembly. There was an amendment to improve, as Stella, you have mentioned, and the monitoring and evaluation framework was developed, has 4 components: the annual report, the joint external evaluation, the simulation exercises, and the after action reviews. But even those are voluntary. Now, for those of you who have participated in the joint external evaluation, I think just to pick as an example, it has been very, very revealing. One of the things we have seen is in some member states or in some countries, it is the first time that the main actors in animal health, environmental health, and the human health have ever sat down to discuss issues on health together as a team. It's when the radioactive or radionuclear units or departments have participated with other units. It has been quite eye-opening, to say the least. So that has been one of the most positive things I have seen as part of the IHR. Now, but after that discussion, member states are supposed to develop the National Action Plan for Health Security. That is good. But we know under the current laws and the regulations within member states or within countries, there's no obligation to provide funding. So you have these beautiful plans, but there's no funding. Also, there's still no clear role of the private partnerships or even community health leaders to ensure their full participation. And not only in the response, but specifically at the planning stages before the disaster strikes. The communities, as we know, at the end of the day, any effective response really depends on the cooperation, collaboration, coordination with the communities at the local level, the village level, the household level. We have not really involved them. Now, moving on to that, again, quoting Dr. John, I think laws and regulations should really focus on the practice of public health. Because if public health is properly practiced, then we will not need to have those emergencies because they'll be caught earlier. And prevention and containment can be applied appropriately. So the IHR, as far as we know, that component of prevention, even though it has been very well elucidated in the 3rd edition of the document, in terms of application, it's still very much response oriented. Now, going a little further is on the integration of the IHR to ensure that all stakeholders in the member states are involved in the development considerations of the cross-border issues. Many of them, I don't need to list all of them, but extremely important is involving all sectors at all times, before the disaster strikes, during, and even during the recovery. I think recovery is another area where it's not well elucidated. Finally, I would like to comment on the Bangkok Principles you mentioned, the disaster risk management and the IHR. Where, to use this phrase, where the rubber hits the road, all those frameworks, the IHR, the disaster risk management, we are dealing with the same community, the same management structure within a country. When you think of the national level, the district level, the regional level, we are dealing with the same community, the same people. I think the question we probably also need to look at, are we, those who are developing or who have developed or participated in bringing up those frameworks, are we overloading those who prepare, those who respond with a lot of frameworks, and really with duplication, so that when you come to the country level, you have the public health emergencies, you have the disaster risk management, you have the disaster unit frameworks, the guidance, and at the end of the day, where the rubber hits the road, it's really about mitigation, prevention, and the resilient recovery. Perhaps, I don't know, this is a challenge to all of us, especially those who are in law, in public health law. Perhaps we may need to look at simplifying this very complex and complex area to navigate, and also to take into account other sectors, the finance sector. For example, in this forum, do we have participants from other sectors where public health emergencies very much depend on in financing? So with those few comments, I stop there to allow further discussion with the participants. So thank you very much, Stella. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mita, for those very poignant reflections on the implementation of international law with regards to public health management in globally and also within the region, and how we're engaging with that. And really, just for that last comment that you made, are we doing too much in terms of the advice and the guidance and the engagement and the frameworks that we're giving member states across the globe in requesting that they develop, or is there still more that needs to be done? And I think that's one of the questions that perhaps we need to reflect on even as we go through these discussions. So we're just going to go back into our rooms, into our breakout rooms, just to address 3 questions. I've just posted the link to the Google Doc. So we're just going to discuss 3 questions during the breakout rooms. I think I'll be able to put you back just in the same groups that you're in to just facilitate the discussions quite quickly, and just see how well we're into. What you think about the integration of disaster risk management laws and policies with respect as well to public health emergency laws and policies. What are the risks or the benefits for greater integration, and how can we achieve greater integration? Your experiences with respect to the challenges and gaps of implementing the IHR at domestic level, as some of the reflections that we've heard from Dr. Muita with that respect. And also just providing some general reflections on those 2 questions from the pilot guidance on whether you think they identify key issues and whether there are any gaps. So with that being said, it's now 4:43 according to my clock. So I'm just going to put you back in the same breakout rooms before. This will be for tomorrow. Let me stop sharing my screen so that I can break out rooms. I think you'll be able to go back into the same rooms. The Google Doc is posted in the chat box, and we should be back in about half an hour, so around 5:15 my time. Thank you. I think we're all coming back into the room for the very last session of the day. I can see Elvis is back, so his group is back. I can see Janique. No, I can't see Janique. I can see Rachel. I think we're just waiting for one more group. Oh, Janique is here. Okay. Janique is here. Great. Thanks everybody for the rich discussions. Really, I'm really so excited to hear about some of the activities that are going on. I'm learning about the work that's going on in Uganda with regards to reviewing the public health emergency laws. So really, really excited to hear the discussions, the outcomes from the discussions of the groups. So I just want to hand over to my colleague, I think it should be Reese, to take us through this particular session, or I should be able to wrap it up, I think. I'm sorry, it should be me. Sorry about that. So just to start off, how about we have a group, I think it should be English group 1. Somebody from the group to give us some discussions, some outputs from their discussion.
Ok. Oui, merci.
Okay. Christy.
Oui, merci de me passer la parole. Est-ce que vous pourriez partager l'écran du Google Sheet sur lequel nous avons travaillé, s'il vous plaît?
D'accord, une seconde, s'il vous plaît. Oh,
merci.
Okay. Merci, Janique.
Voilà. Donc, merci de me passer la parole. Donc, s'agissant de la première question sur les relations entre les systèmes de gestion des risques et des catastrophes et les systèmes de gestion des urgences santé publique, nous avons noté qu'il y a des conflits qui existent entre les autorités en charge de la gestion des catastrophes et celles en charge des urgences santé publique. La conséquence de ces conflits, ce sont les duplications, c'est la faible efficacité, par exemple pour la réponse au COVID-19. Il y a également, on a noté également une faible collaboration entre ces autorités-là. Et nous avons pensé que pour pouvoir améliorer l'intégration entre ces deux systèmes qui sont complémentaires, ce sera intéressant d'harmoniser la terminologie et les concepts, les modes opératoires. Parce que bon, dans les systèmes de santé publique, on parle beaucoup de gestion des incidents de plus en plus. On parle beaucoup de centres des opérations d'urgence de santé publique, mais ce n'est pas la même terminologie de l'autre côté, où on va vous parler beaucoup plus, pour ce que je connais un peu dans mon pays, de plan rouge, de plan blanc, etc. Donc, c'est important qu'il y ait une harmonisation de toutes ces terminologies-là. Et cette harmonisation peut être facilitée par le fait de collaborer entre tous ces secteurs-là, toutes ces autorités-là, avant que ne surviennent des événements. Nous avons également pensé que le fait de mutualiser les ressources, de planifier ensemble et d'avoir une approche multirisque dans la planification, le développement des politiques et des lois pouvait aider dans ce sens-là. Prochaine question, s'il vous plaît. Donc, pour ce qui concerne la seconde question, non, voilà, la question relative aux lacunes ou bien aux défis dans la mise en œuvre du RSI, le rôle des lois et puis la nécessité d'un comité pour surveiller la mise en œuvre du RSI. Nous avons pensé qu'en termes de défis, il y a les ressources humaines qualifiées dans les secteurs concernés par la mise en œuvre du RSI. Parce que nous avons pensé que tout le monde parle du RSI, mais souvent, la connaissance réelle qu'on a du RSI n'est pas la connaissance appropriée. Nous avons noté également comme défi la faible diffusion et la faible compréhension du RSI dans les niveaux inférieurs des systèmes de santé et les autres secteurs. Donc, on a beaucoup présenté le règlement sanitaire international comme étant quelque chose qui devait se discuter au niveau central dans les systèmes de santé. Donc, comment est-ce qu'on peut surmonter ces défis-là selon nous? Nous pensons que ce serait bien de développer une approche de mise en œuvre du RSI qui suit les pyramides sanitaires dans les pays, c'est-à-dire centrale, intermédiaire et puis locale. Nous pensons également que ça pourrait être intéressant d'avoir en place un mécanisme de suivi de la mise en œuvre du RSI qui intègre les organisations de la société civile. Parce que jusqu'à présent, les éléments de suivi de la mise en œuvre sont très centrés sur l'État, que ce soit les évaluations externes, que ce soit l'obligation pour les États de faire un rapport, de faire le rapport annuel, que ce soit même tout ce qui est exercice de simulation. Généralement, ce sont des mécanismes qui sont centrés sur le point de vue de l'État. C'est important de notre point de vue qu'on ait un mécanisme qui intègre le point de vue des acteurs autres que l'État de façon autonome, comme on peut le voir sur certaines conventions en droit, du droit international des droits de l'homme. Nous avons également pensé que plutôt que de créer des instances supplémentaires pour monitorer la mise en œuvre du RSI, ce serait bien de renforcer dans les pays le rôle et la place du point focal national du RSI qui pourrait servir de cadre pour pouvoir effectivement assurer cette surveillance-là. Et puis, nous avons également noté la faible spécificité des lois relatives à la santé publique. C'est là où nous sommes arrêtés dans notre groupe. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, Christy, for that brief outline of your group's discussions. I think one of the things that has really just stuck out for me is really that need to integrate those concepts, so that when you're talking about integration, you're all speaking, the same language. I just want to hand over now to the next group. It should be, I think, Rachel, your group. I'm not really sure which group that was. I think it was English group 1 or 2.
Yes, we were English group 1, and Asma has very, very kindly agreed to share the group's comments again. Thank you, Asma.
Thanks, Asma. Over to you.
Thank you. So this time we're going to go step by step. We're going to take each question. So for the first question, We had multiple encounters over the past 2 years on a large scale of multiple countries dealing with public health emergencies and natural disasters at the same time. How to integrate both emergency policies will help benefit the time lapsed for the management of both and the direct relation that is very apparent to everyone to help control the different solutions, to help control the different solutions and the different emergencies within both sectors. The coordinated approach within ministries and departments with different specialties to work together to help governance and policymaking to make a unified decision for deliverance. I think working together, basically this was what was happening in the past 2 years with every representative from every country actually shared experiences in regards to this topic. For one, the integrational approach of the internal displacement that we spoke about earlier concludes that the engagement of multiple governmental sectors to coordinate the committee for decision-making and distribution of roles and responsibilities, which was a good example of governance. Also, identifying possible triggers and responding to the emergencies within the multiple units, very challenging for multiple countries to join, but both proper coordination to achieve this objective because of the multiple ministries involved can cause challenges when implementation solutions for assistance. Finding a way to collaborate between legal and public health laws to defend the structure for the public services, to find, to public health laws to defend the structure for public services and to find the resources for implementation. Most of the problems were with the points of entry. These were the gaps when trying to realistically deliver. Again, laws and policies that are discussed are at cabinet levels, ministries, governmental sectors, and parliament, and it is not domesticated. And the funding is key when deliverance is at hand, and when the fund is allocated, it is also discussed at cabinet level. For example, we also talked about water crossing for movement, border crossing in general within different countries. The IHR isn't adapted for all countries in specific border crossing. For prosperous countries that have this as an ongoing mechanism happening in and out of the countries, there are different binding laws when it comes to this specific topic in general. Monitoring on behalf of IHR for points of entry within countries can help map the risks and management of the multiple points of entry. This was a recommendation made. For example, in Uganda, there is the acceleration team for the National Action Plan for Health Security. The main responsibility of this team is to monitor and accelerate the implementation of IHR. And another recommendation made was that there would be a joint external evaluation within the countries to discuss the challenges and the recommendations yearly or 3 times a year, reviewed within governmental and national society levels, gives an overview and goes through the process of discussion, recommendations, lessons learned, and they are not always taken into consideration in means of advocating for these recommendations, as they are decided within key players who may not be consistent within the government, and thus the funding may not have been discussed, but the consistency of the attending members is not always consistent with the governmental change at hand. Unfortunately, we did not have time to discuss question number 3, so over to you, Rachel.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Asma. Yes, as Asma mentioned, we didn't quite get around to discussing a question 3, which was really the question that focuses on the guidance and whether the guidance adequately addresses the issues. But we've, as Asma mentioned, we've had a very good discussion of the issues in general, which I think Ifrc disaster law will find helpful in finalizing the guidance. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who participated in the group.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Asma. Thanks, Rachel, for those the breakdown of your group's discussion. I think it was quite clear, just understanding how other countries are experiencing in terms of their challenges and gaps in implementing IHR. Really encouraging to hear about the example from Uganda, and hoping to see how we could, within this network, begin to encourage such kind of initiatives, if not already present in different countries. Now just handing over to the last group, that's English Group 2. Please go ahead.
Hi, Stella. Unfortunately, we didn't specifically appoint a speaker for this session, but we did have a very, very interactive discussion. So I would like to invite either Mr. Makumbi or Professor Chiluchi or Dr. Maeda to please go ahead and share. I can share my screen if it will help with the summary of our discussion. But if anyone would be willing to sort of give a summary of what we spoke about, I'd be very happy to share my screen. I just ask you that you raise your hand, please. Thank you, Professor. Please go ahead. I'll share my screen for you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. We had a brilliant discussion in our group. And for question 1, we dealt with how well integrated DRM and PHE laws are and policies in our region and our country. We had quite a few experiences to share. In general, we found that they were not well integrated. Public health emergency laws are typically designed to respond to emergencies, but DRM laws tend to be separate, and we have definitely those two areas of laws in different silos. In general, only after the incident becomes a national level emergency and surpasses sectoral management do we have DRM actors becoming involved, while of course, at least for public health emergencies, there are, from the local levels all the way up, we have different agencies working. So definitely greater integration could be achieved through the participation of different sectors, which is currently not the case in many African countries today. We also found that the architecture of responding to public health emergencies isn't very well developed, and usually we do that through a temporary mechanism, through a task force, as many of us saw during the height of the pandemic last year. When a new threat comes, we set up a new mechanism to deal with it. So sometimes there isn't a systematic way to pass on the lessons that we have learned into the next emergency, be it public health or other hazard. National action plans for health security can play an important role, but this needs to be institutionalized and anchored through existing institutions rather than through the temporary mechanisms that we have typically set up when we have an emergency. There's also need for integration in order to allow for resource allocation and, dare I say, efficiency. Most public health emergencies are considered a health matter and not a multi-sectoral matter, and I'm sure that this is something that we can all align with, so that health gets most of the resources as well. Planning and response needs to be incorporated into all sectors, so that all sectors are responsible for preventing, for preparing, and for responding to issues. So not just public health emergencies, but any disaster. So basically, taking a holistic multi-sectoral approach is really important. In Uganda, specifically, integration starts within the constitution, but it's then also complemented by a public health emergency law policy, which articulates the roles and responsibilities of different actors in public health emergencies. We also found that just in general, public health emergencies and other disasters are dealt with by different ministries at different operational levels where integration occurs. Okay, I don't know what OP we were talking about here. Okay, going to question 2, in our experience, what are the challenges or gaps in implementing the IHR at the domestic level, and what role could laws and policies play in facilitating better implementation, and so on. So here we had very interesting conversations, and we came up with some recommendations. First, it's important to enable peripheral institutions to decentralize to implement IHR at domestic levels. Furthermore, law schools have an important role to play. There is definitely a need to educate and train lawyers on public health and health security in general. This is not something that we have a surfeit of in on the continent. Many lawyers are not trained in public health. We also needed to go the other way too, with public health emergency leaders being trained also in understanding the role of law in the work that they do. National public health institutes, these can serve as centers to guide in research and interventions, including legal research, and they can drive the development of new approaches and interventions. Other sectors should also be embraced so that we're not just focusing on only public health, but all the broader aspects of disaster management and emergency management. These are separate from, and National Public Health Institutes are separate from DRM institutions, and laws tend to also be different. So we need legal mappings at domestic levels in different countries to understand where we are and to understand what the gaps are and what needs to be done. And this needs to be done in tandem with understanding the political economy and the political context of any particular place. The constitutional framework of a country also needs to be considered. We need to look at the legal system and the relationship with international law. And one of the first things that we need to do in assessing countries is to understand the legal system and the framework so that we understand how coordination and integration works from a legal perspective. Okay, generally, what we find also is that, all our actions tend to be limited to the health sector, but there are a number of sectors that play a role in the IHR, whether we're talking about finance or even food and safety and so on. So advocacy is needed to raise awareness and understanding of the interplay between all these different sectors. There's also that problem with enforcement, lack of teeth in, and lack of enforcement, basically, especially where there's lack of compliance with the IHR. Also, the process to domesticate international agreements can be burdensome and typically requires quite a bit of work and quite a bit of lobbying, if I might say, for laws that are made for the implementation of IHR to become enforceable. Okay, I think that's where we stopped. I think most of us couldn't get to 3, but it was a very interesting session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that breakdown of the sessions. I could see that the discussions, as rich as they were, we are having some conclusions that are quite similar. So there are challenges that we're facing within the region that we can be able to discuss within a network and try to find how we can best overcome these challenges on how to implement international law with regards to public health management. And I'm glad that we've been able to have this forum with yourselves being in the room with IFRC colleagues as well as Africa CDC. And hopefully we could be able to come up with some discussion points on next steps in our discussions tomorrow as we think about how we can better support each other as a peer network in engagement on these issues. And I think with that, we come to the end of today's session. Thank you very, very much for your vibrant and engaging discussions during the sessions. It has been really very interesting to follow the discussions we've been having in the breakout rooms. And I'm really hoping that you've been able to learn a bit more about the report, the Law and Public Health report, the lessons from COVID-19. Just to let you know that the report is available on the Ifrc Disaster Law website, and we will be able to share the link with you. So we're looking forward to meeting with you all again tomorrow for the last session as we go over the last half of the report and as well as the last half of the pilot guidance, as we try to as well understand what we need to do to really improve public health management within the continent of Africa. So for me, I just want to extend my sincere thanks to you for your engagements. I could see we have a couple of hands up, one from Dr. Shanta and also from Professor. Please go ahead, Dr. Shanta, then Professor.
Thank you, Stella. Colleagues, esteemed colleagues and everyone, just one small query. Like, if we are supposed to be integrating disaster management as well as public health and emergencies, I see nowhere surveillance coming in. Without surveillance, how do we integrate? Like, this should be, like this, I found a gap. And it could be one of the tools where both these departments could be brought in a better way. Over.
Thanks so much, Dr. Shanta, for your question. I think Dr. Muita wants to respond to that. Go ahead, Dr. Muita, over to you.
Yes, thank you. In the recent review of the performance of the IHR, the response to COVID-19, which is still ongoing anyway, the review, the independent panel led by Madame Her Excellency Elaine Johnson Sirleaf, one of the recommendations they made, this was recommendation number 4, was to establish international surveillance and validation system. Because you're right, Professor, surveillance is actually the other and opposite arm of responding to disasters and managing disasters as well. The other one is, of course, the laboratory part of it, and that goes hand in hand. I see some colleagues here from the Africa CDC and the regional collaborating centers. One of the other push that actually institution that I remember Dr. Justin referred to a little bit earlier is the LESINET, which is the regional integrated surveillance and laboratory network, which is actually supposed to address this issue of surveillance. It's absolutely key, and it goes hand in hand with the event-based, without going into details, event-based surveillance, but also early warning, so that authorities, national authorities, are able to respond to events on the horizon. The final point I'd like to make is, which goes with that, is preparedness. We cannot underestimate the issue of preparedness. The other recommendation that supports surveillance is pre-negotiated supplies, because if you recall early in the COVID-19 pandemic, the issue of testing, tests had to be developed very quickly, but they were not universally available. Or, for example, on the African continent, we were not those lucky enough to get those tests, to be able to test and trace the infection on our continent. So that was another recommendation made by the independent panel. They made a total of 7. I will not go through them on the interest of time. But one more point I wanted to go back to, Stella, before you close, is to, as John said at the beginning, and if I could say this on behalf of Africa CDC, is that this collaboration and is extremely important. These partnerships play a very great role. Africa CDC is very much supportive and indeed encouraging of partnerships, respectful, functional, productive, active partnerships. So Ifrc has done a tremendous job, but this has not happened before at all. So this is a great effort that we look forward to continue developing this area. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mwita, for that. I'll just hand over to Dr. Justin for the final comment before we wrap up.
Sure. Thank you, Stella. I think the key issue here is more of a multi-sectoral approach in all the areas, from the detection, of which not only surveillance, but going beyond surveillance and say the early warning system, establishing early warning system that touches all sectors to ensure that each sector can be able to detect any threat that has a stake on the public health. And across jointly through all these early warning systems that are established within multiple sectors, you collaborate to share information across sectors so that we all know what to anticipate in the future. Second, the same preparedness to make sure that all the early warning findings informs our preparedness to be sure that in case if we cannot prevent, but at least we should be prepared to tackle what the early warning system is telling us ahead of time before they happen. And then joint response in the same holistic approach, we're using a multi-sectoral approach to cover all the sectors, and also the recovery time where we also do a joint planning to cover all the areas, including improving our early warning system to capture it early on. So that I wanted to just make that clear as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Justin, for that point of clarification. And I appreciate the inputs that we have had from Dr. Martin as well and Dr. Shanta. And they really just preempt the discussions that we're going to have tomorrow in session 4, which is basically about preparing and responding to public health emergencies. So we're talking about how this early warning, early action systems being put into place with respect to public health emergency. I'm really interested to hear about your perspectives and building on this discussion that we're having that's wrapping up this discussion. And I'm encouraged to see we are already thinking about the discussions we're going to have tomorrow. Despite the fact that we may not have dwelled too much on surveillance in the report that we carried out, but this is definitely something that we need to think about, just as how Dr. Shanta has elaborated on it, and as well as Dr. Mwita has discussed on the same. It's something that we need to study so that we can see how we can look in the future about how we can have this kind of integrated approach and understanding towards surveillance. So with that being said, I'd really just like to again thank you all for your very, very excited participation in this session. It really has been very interesting to hear your perspectives. I'm really just very excited to just engage with you all. I'm always very excited to build networks in different issues that touch the African continent. And I'm encouraged to see that there are very many like-minded people as well who have been able to join us in this room. So with that being said, I'd just like to say thank you once again, and do have a good rest of your evening. We'll be able to meet up again tomorrow, same time. The link will be the same, and I think it should be shared in your calendar invites. So just if you're not able to see it in your calendar invite for tomorrow, the link should be exactly the same as the one for today. So thank you all once again, and looking forward to meeting with you all here tomorrow. Thank you, and God bless. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stella.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.